The title of the talk is The Second Baptism of Rusi, the Soviet Experiment Between Secularization and Desecularization. And I want to say a couple of words about myself and my background and what brings me to this project. I'm an historian, so I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a social anthropologist like some of my colleagues, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a political theorist. So I have a fairly simple question at the heart of my talk, which is to try to understand and to explain change over time. As a historian, my work is on religion and atheism, initially in the USSR, in the Soviet Union, and that is the subject of my book, which came out last year, and which will be coming out in Russian in 2020. And now I'm interested in questions of religion and secularism beyond the Soviet Union. Now, my book on atheism begins and ends with an event, namely the celebration of the baptism of Rusi in 1988 as a national event, which became the moment in which religion re-entered the national narrative and therefore politics and public life. Now, this was a development that at the time surprised both internal and external observers. This was not something that people anticipated, even people who had been watching and paying attention to this topic for decades leading up to it. So in the course of writing the book, a set of new questions emerged for me, which I'm now looking to answer in this next project. And namely, how and why did religion return, quote unquote, and how and why did secularism as a political project in both its liberal and atheist guise find itself increasingly pushed to the margins over the course of the end of the 20th century. So moving on to the story, I want to start with the year 2013. And on July 22nd, 2013, on the occasion of the 1025th anniversary of the baptism of Rusi, the television channel Россия-1 aired a documentary about the return of religion and of orthodoxy in particular to Russian public life following 7 decades of communism. It was produced by Ilarion, a member of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it told a straightforward story of religious revival in which the Russian people and the Russian nation returned to their authentic spiritual foundations after a troubled period of political repression and ideological confusion. The origins of this return in the documentary were located in the year 1988 with the public celebration of the millennium. And this event was cast as something that reestablished something that was basically the natural order of things. In contemporary Russia, Orthodox Christianity, and then more broadly the so-called traditional religions, have become central to the state's management of politics, ideology, and culture. Now, in an interview in the documentary, President Putin said that the communist moral code, the moral code of the builders of communism, was basically grounded in religious moral principles. And that when this moral code, quote unquote, stopped existing, a moral vacuum formed that could be filled with only one thing: the return to true, real values, which could only be religious in character. So this documentary presents a very specific narrative of the role of religion and of the Russian Orthodox Church in particular in Russian history, namely that the return of religion, either as a revival or a rediscovery, is presented as both natural and inevitable. But this is deceptive, because in fact the return of religion was one of the most surprising developments in modern history. Which, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, was dominated by a narrative of secularization. And what I want to do today is offer a genealogy of religion's return to politics and public life at the end of the 20th century, by analyzing the ways in which this process was entangled, in particular with the perceived threat of communism, atheism, and secularism. So what I'm going to do now is talk about the return of religion in the global arena and focus much less on the Soviet case, in part because I think everybody in this room is already familiar with the Soviet story, more or less, and also because it's in my book, so I feel like I'm more interested in the ways that the Soviet story is actually connected to a bigger global phenomenon. Now, the return of religion to politics and public life at the end of the 20th century, as I said, is one of the most unexpected developments in modern history. But so far, explanations have focused on globalization and the rise of fundamentalism, largely ignoring the Soviet side of the story, anti-communism, and the Cold War context. But over the course of the 20th century, and especially during the Cold War, religion and communism were of course engaged in what both sides perceived to be an existential conflict. And this made religious affairs and Soviet believers the subject of much attention among different institutions and groups, including Catholics and the Vatican, Protestants and the World Council of Churches, the ecumenical movement, the Jewish diaspora, Muslim groups, American evangelical Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and eventually human rights organizations. During the Cold War, Soviet believers, and especially those who were not members of the Orthodox Church, and those who were concentrated on the Soviet Union's borderlands and were perceived to have connections with their so-called co-religionists abroad, became a contested phenomenon between Soviet communism, which for the outside world had long embodied secular modernity, and the religious movements that sought to defeat communism and challenge the perceived hegemony of the secular state. And those two projects, I think, were very much intertwined, the defeat of communism and the kind of fight against the rise of a kind of a perception of secular hegemony. The return of religion was surprising for both sides of the Cold War struggle. For the Soviet side, religion's return was surprising because of the assumed connection between communist modernity and atheism. Indeed, atheism was important to both the Soviet domestic and international affairs. Domestically, it was an inherent part of the Marxist-Leninist platform, but on the international stage, it was arguably even more important than it was domestically. It was seen as central to the very essence of Soviet communism, calling forth responses from the Vatican, which denounced atheistic communism, for example, in the encyclical in 1937, calling forth a reaction from the American political establishment, which in the early Cold War years mobilized against so-called godless communism as part of the broader anti-communist mobilization, just to give two examples. So this perception made religion and atheism in the Soviet Union a key part of these broader political, ideological, and cultural wars of the 20th century. For Western observers, religion's return was unexpected because it ran against this narrative of secularization, which held that as society became more modern, religion would become less significant in political, social, and ultimately individual life. Religion, the secularization thesis posited, would withdraw from politics and public life and become meaningful above all in the private sphere, eventually losing its relevance even there. And for a century, arguably since the end of the 19th century, secularization remained the dominant framework for understanding the relationship between religion, politics, and modernity, a framework that reached its height, its apotheosis in the 1960s, when both secular and religious observers believed that religion was in crisis and that its death was both inevitable and imminent. Interestingly, a conviction that was shared on both sides of the Iron Curtain. So while in the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, you have propaganda posters of Soviet cosmonauts flying to space and saying there's no God, in the In Time magazine in the US, the cover, there's a famous cover that says, "Is God dead?" Right? So there's this kind of consensus, and what differed was whether you were celebrating or lamenting this perception of the decline of religion and the death of God. But over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, both religious and secular observers lost their confidence in secularization as a framework that explained religious change and religion's place and future in the modern world. And this leads to the second reason that religion's return to public life is surprising. It was unexpected because it was global, occurring in the Middle East and Latin America and the United States, Eastern Europe, and the USSR, notably not in Western Europe or Great Britain, which is a separate case. But beyond those, that fairly small part of the world, Western Europe and Great Britain, you see a rise in the significance, the social significance of religion. By the end of the 1970s, religion again becomes both visible and politically contested on the world stage in numerous ways. The Vatican, with its turn to the global south and its much more deliberate policy vis-a-vis the communist world, especially, of course, as everyone knows, with the election of the Polish Pope in 1978. Then the mobilization of the human rights movement in defense of persecuted believers behind the Iron Curtain, formalized in 1975 with the Helsinki Accords. Then the new political visibility of Islam, which entered the global arena with the 1979 revolution in Iran, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And finally, the centrality of anti-communism and anti-secularism to the rise of evangelical Christianity and the religious right in the United States, the so-called moral majority, in the late 1970s. Now, for the outside observer, that transformation of evangelical Christianity from a religious social movement into a political movement seemed very sudden. Indeed, it seemed to happen almost overnight in 1979, and yet played a decisive role in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So evangelical Christians in the US realized that religion could not actually, or that they could not defend themselves if they kept themselves apart from the world, that they had to enter into political institutions in order to have any influence on the social questions that mattered to them most. Incidentally, the evangelical leader Jerry Falwell was likened at the time by critics to the Ayatollah Khomeini as a figure that violated a certain perceived boundary between religion and politics in the liberal order. So my question is, can we see these as part of the same process? Is there a structural explanation, something that unifies these movements and makes them mutually influential? And I think that the answer, at least in part, is yes. And one, I think, unifying element is their anti-communism and anti-secularism. Now, I think there are four phases that we can observe if we follow this story from the beginning of the Cold War, so at the 1945, the end of World War II, until the collapse of communism. And what you see is essentially two actors. Religious institutions, and I'm presenting something very schematic and very simplified, but for the purposes of kind of tracing something that's otherwise quite hard to grasp. So if you see two kinds of actors, religious institutions or the state, religious institutions or the church, and political institutions or the state, and two kinds of phenomena, religion on the one hand, secularism on the other, fighting for society, for a kind of ability to enter into dialogue with, to influence, and to mobilize society. Now, the first phase of this moment is from 1945 to, I would say, the mid-1950s. And here you see the church and the state both using religion to mobilize an ostensibly secular society for the purpose of anti-communism. Here I'm speaking primarily about the United States, but also Europe. So you have what you see in the early Cold War era from 1945 until the mid-1950s is a kind of anti-communist panic, the creation of all sorts of institutions, for example, the Congress of Cultural Freedom in 1950, and the emergence of a certain political and ideological consensus around what sociologist Will Herberg at the time called tri-faith America, so Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And in this moment, it's the first time in American history that Catholics and Jews actually enter into the political and social mainstream along with Protestants. This politically, this consensus begins to fray in the mid-1950s. And I think what is interesting there is that it frays because the anti-communist threat declines with, or the communist threat declines with Stalin's death and de-Stalinization. They become a very important moment because then the threat of communist totalitarianism seems to recede. With the seeming transformation of communism into some new form, right, some kind of reformed and more liberal form, you see the political mobilization of religion receding. One position is the so-called end of ideology thesis that becomes prominent in intellectual circles. It's put forward by Raymond Aron, a French intellectual, and the basic idea is that socialism is no longer about millennial expectations, but about social welfare and the welfare state. Therefore, it's no longer necessary to mobilize ideologically against it. Now, even at the time, there was dissent from this position, most notably among the so-called the emerging neoliberals like Hayek, who refused to believe that the end of ideology was happening or even near. Then in the long 1960s, you also observe society turning away from institutional authority, both in its religious and its political guise. So both the rejection of church and state authority. You see the decline of traditional religious practices, the decline of the reproduction of religious authority over generations, and there's a great book by Hugh MacLeod called The Religious Crisis of the 1960s. At stake were social and moral questions. Who gets to define moral position on social questions like marriage, abortion, homosexual rights, and what is permissible in the public sphere? It was no longer up to either political or religious authorities to create the consensus around these questions. Now, what's interesting to me is that the religious institutions react to this by moving toward a dialogue, both with society on the one hand and with their former political opponents, namely communist states. And I think you see this most visibly, of course, in Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, where suddenly the church revisits all sorts of social issues that until then had not been up for discussion, as well as it changes its position on very contentious topics like the Jewish question, ecumenism, its relations with the socialist bloc, right? So these are very big shifts that are taking place in the religious sides. You have other examples of this dialogue. For example, the World Council of Churches becomes very active, and even the Russian Orthodox Church joins it in 1961. So really, dialogue becomes the operating framework of the 1960s. So you have two narratives that emerge from the so-called long 1960s. One narrative about religious crisis, the sense that religious institutions are losing authority over society, and the second, which is a confidence in secularization as inevitable, at least among those who think about these things, which, as it turns out, is mostly university professors, right? So this is this is when Peter Berger's Sacred Canopy is published as this kind of narrative of inevitable religious decline. And then you get to the 1970s, and this is when I think things get interesting and unexpected, because what you see in the 1970s is that the religious and political institutions basically lose any space for dialogue with society, which is to say that they realized that society is just not interested in having any kinds of conversations with institutions representing authority. And they begin to have a dialogue instead with each other on religion and secularism. So for example, one very vivid example of this is that the Vatican hosts a conference in 1969 called The Culture of Unbelief. And on the one side of that dialogue, you have the newly created Secretariat of Unbelief, that's the Vatican Secretariat of Unbelief, in which theologians and church functionaries are studying the secular. And on the other side, you have Western sociologists and lay theologians who are studying religion, right? So you have this kind of, these institutional and intellectual authorities who are thinking about these questions by studying the other side. But what they realize through that dialogue is that they have a number actually of shared anxieties. Well, first they realize that they're talking to each other and no one else is really listening. And the second thing they realize is that they actually share a number of anxieties about society. They believe that society, both sides, both the religious and the kind of political elites, believe that society has become individualistic and egoistic, decadent and materialistic, and indifferent, most importantly, indifferent to both religious and political questions and authority. But of course, society in the 1970s is not only individualistic, decadent, and indifferent. In this period, you also see the rise and flourishing of new religious movements, political and religious dissidents, and the human rights movement, which mobilize society around both religious and political questions, but outside of the traditional institutional frameworks of authority that are customary for political and religious elite. Now, looking at this new reality, what you see is political and religious institutions reacting differently to the breakdown of dialogue between religious institutions and society. Religious institutions actually make a very interesting move. They see the bankruptcy of power politics and they turn away from the state and turn to focus almost exclusively on social rather than political questions. And they do this in a way, I think, to find their way back to society and to reestablish a new kind of social legitimacy. Western states, on their end, especially Western liberal states, did very little to bridge this new gulf beyond between the state and society, beyond filling it with consumer goods and to a lesser degree trying to ally themselves with human rights movements, but they are really being reactive rather than proactive. So in the 1970s, we see the religious institutions turn to social movements and mobilize them politically, and the state really stays on the sideline of this. One of the key ways they find their way back to society is by presenting religious institutions as repositories of authentic national identity and culture. And moreover, authentic national identity and culture that was being betrayed or simply ignored by the secular state, which ostensibly does not care about things like culture, tradition, or religion. And this theme comes up over and over, for example, in various encyclicals and statements by John Paul II, who makes a clear distinction between the church as a defender of the nation and culture, and the state whose primary function is social welfare, and that's where it should stay. So in a way, the question is, where is the state of all this? And I think what's fascinating is by the end of the 1970s, it's early into the 1980s, the secular state is really left to the side of these social processes without charisma and without legitimacy. So you end with these two seemingly contradictory processes that characterize social life, both the religious and the secular, at the end of the Cold War and I think into our present day. The two seemingly contradictory processes are, on the one hand, the apparent secularization of society, And on the other hand, the desecularization of politics. And interestingly, the religious and secular sides disagree about the place of religion and secularism in contemporary life. So depending on who you ask, religion is either everywhere or it's nowhere. The secular side, looking at the desecularization of politics, claims that religion is everywhere, that secularism is threatened, if not actively under attack. And the religious side, looking at the secularization of society, looking at figures like low church attendance or low religious literacy, claims that secularism is everywhere, and that secularism indeed has a hegemony, and that the real threat is actually to religion. And what I think is really interesting, and what I'm trying to figure out, is that in fact, is that they are both right, and they're both wrong. Thank you.
Victoria, any questions, discussions?
Да, спасибо. Ну, я по-русски все-таки буду задавать вопрос, ничего. Значит...
Подожди секундочку.
Да. Okay. I can ask in English. No problems. Yeah, too late. Okay. Тогда буду по-русски. Вот. Значит, собственно говоря, вопрос у меня на некотором историческом сравнении вот того, что происходит, ну, условно говоря, там в конце 60-х, 70-е годы, ну, в либеральном мире, там, или в Америке конкретно, и в Советском Союзе, потому что, ну, вот из того, что ты говоришь, как бы следует, что вот это некоторая, так сказать, ну, озабоченность, anxiety по поводу морали в, ну, скажем, американском обществе этой эпохи, она связана с кризисом религиозного авторитета. Вот, но что довольно любопытно, что в Советском Союзе, и вот ты начала с Путина и морального кодекса строителя коммунизма, в Советском Союзе, ну, уже в 60-е происходит, и на самом деле по-своему даже нарастает в течение 70-х годов, ну, своего рода паника по поводу имморальности. Но при этом кризиса как бы религиозного авторитета там нет, потому что это атеистическое государство. То есть мы можем говорить, что, может быть, как Юрчак в принципе это делает, что кризис сталинизма, вот как политического культа, каким-то образом можно уравнять с кризисом религии, но у меня все-таки по этому поводу есть некоторые сомнения. Я вот хотел спросить, что ты думаешь по этому поводу, вот, потому что одинаковые процессы происходят вроде бы в разных условиях.
Да, спасибо большое за вопрос. Мне тоже, вот я когда писала первую книгу и дошла до 70-х, я тоже заметила вот сходность этих процессов, особенно читая книги, ну, например, того же Маклауда про религиозный кризис, индивидуализм и новые религиозные движения, и замечая, что нечто подобное, вот нечто подобное происходит в Советском Союзе, как минимум в глазах партийных работников, которые это изучают. И я думаю, что кризис там не религиозного авторитета, потому что религиозного авторитета там нет как такового. Там, ну, как минимум, как бы общественного, а политического авторитета, идеологического авторитета. Потому что когда, вот, например, занимаются социологическими исследованиями и находят вот этот феномен индифферентности молодежи к этим вопросам идеологическим и религиозным, они видят этот кризис как моральный и духовный кризис, который не может найти политический ответ в партии. Поэтому я вижу это как два параллельных такого феномена.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы?
In English?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating paper, and I think it's extremely important to do what you're doing. and look for more than local explanations for what's a global phenomenon. And I also very much like the idea that you've got a pair of two different sets of institutions, state institutions and religious institutions, because the previous explanations have tended to focus on either on religion all on its own without pairing it with anything, or to focus on religion as an idea against secular ideologies as alternative ideas. So I think you're absolutely on the right track here. What I'm wondering about is whether it's the same institutions that come back, because you know I work on the Muslim world, and the official institutions that were discredited in the 20s and 30s and 40s have really vanished forever. And when Islam comes back, it's new institutions. And when one's thinking about Latin America, for example, the collapse of the Catholic Church in Latin America over recent decades is dramatic, and it's new institutions that are coming back. So what happens? I mean, apparently, it's still the same Russian Orthodox Church. Yeah, apparently. That's my question.
No, it's a really important observation, and I'm really glad that you underscore that what comes back. Yeah, I don't at all mean to say that there's something called religion and it kind of goes away and then the same thing comes back. But what I think is interesting, and I'm still kind of working through this analytically, but what I think is interesting is that the way that certain religious mobilizations make their case for why social movements should embrace their ideology is by presenting themselves not as new in a way, but as eternal and old, and against this kind of idea of a modern temporality that embraces progress and leaves all things like tradition behind. So I think in the rest of the world where you're kind of noticing a lot of these religious, quote unquote revivals, I think there you really have to look at local, I think that's when you have to step away from the kind of global and go back into local, because the example I know best, which is the Russian Orthodox Church, what happens here is in broad strokes what happens elsewhere, except that here, and this is kind of how my book on atheism ends, at one point, basically, the party and ideological apparatus that's for the previous, decade and a half, been observing the decline of their authority in society, realizes, and they basically say this explicitly, our atheist cadres are terrible. Atheism is not interesting to anybody. But in fact, we have this other institution with its own patriotic cadres. And, thus far, we've been kind of keeping them at arm's length and not allowing them to come into the public sphere and to speak to social concerns. But since our answer to these questions, atheism, has been completely discredited, and since the very kind of notion of communism is now under threat, shouldn't we just kind of make a partnership? And this was something that really actually shifted between, at least in the documents that I see, between that decision, right, from the party shifted between 1985 and 1988. So it's a perestroika decision. It's really a move of political desperation. And I think that's what makes it, the contingency and kind of unexpectedness of it is what makes it politically or kind of historically specific. But what comes back, I think, what comes back is a kind of a new kind of partnership where essentially one of the cadres that I cite in my book, he says, well, what's better for us, people who believe in religion and Soviet power, or people who believe in nothing? That for them is the choice, right? Is to stop drawing that boundary, or that, creating a dichotomy between religion and Soviet power, and saying, actually, you you can do both, because the alternative is people who believe in nothing. Not, or at least nothing that they represent, nothing that the party represents.
Коллеги, есть ли еще вопросы к докладчику?
Да, можно вопрос? Виктория, спасибо за интересную тематику. Я хотел спросить, я подумал, вы сказали, что фактически в 1978 году евангелисты избрали Рейгана. Я подумал о том, что 2 года назад евангелисты играли тоже ключевую роль в американских выборах. И вы также упомянули 60-е, 70-е, процесс либерализации в обществе, который в западном шел, там, понятно, сексуальная свобода, эксперименты с наркотиками, права и так далее. И мы тоже видим в современном американском дискурсе, вы живете там, поэтому я хотел как бы от вас узнать. То есть фактически есть такой же никуда не уходящий клэш или как бы водораздел. Есть консервативное общество, одноэтажная Америка, права на ношение оружия, церковь, воскресенье. И мы видим, какую роль они играют, в том числе, как эти люди влияют на американскую внешнюю политику. Да? Трамп полностью за Израиль, потому что это земля обетованная. Евангелисты, понятно, да? Вот, то есть что, ничто не ново под луной получается? 40 лет прошло, все то же самое. С одной стороны есть консерваторы, одноэтажная Америка, а с другой стороны городское теперь женские права, права трансгендеров, вот этот политкорректный дискурс, да, который мы видим в крупных городах США. Да. Ваша оценка, вот это, там, прошло 50 лет, 40 лет, ничего не меняется? Спасибо.
Это очень важный вопрос, но я не уверена, что я могу ответить по-русски. Я могу перейти на английский. So I think it's the process that I described, this kind of shift from staying out of the secular world and keeping apart and seeing the protection and preservation of the religious way of life by staying outside, to actually realizing that you cannot stay outside and preserve that way of life if you take seriously such issues as abortion and homosexuality, because they are basically being imposed on you, and therefore you have to enter into politics to actually defend those things that matter to you. I think that's the beginning of that moment is in the late 1970s, but I think that it has continued into the present day, because I think one of the reasons that religious institutions are interesting to study is because they play the long game, right? They don't have to get reelected. They don't have to. They're thinking, they're not thinking in 4-year cycles. They're thinking in decades. They're thinking in millennia. And if you listen to the discourse of the evangelicals, they see themselves as at war with a kind of secular hegemonic world, and for them there's proof, because the state still has a monopoly pretty much on secular education, right? They're not allowed to, unless they're in specifically religious schools. There's still abortion, they're still fighting this war. Now there's gay marriage, right? So they really see themselves actually as on the defensive and slowly making inroads, chipping away at these what they call secular values. So I think it's just you're seeing a kind of ascending wave of that process, which doesn't mean that it's going to win and that'll be the end of it. But I think it's still very much the same story, actually. I think and they think of it as that way. They see their own genealogy kind of coming out of that.
Вообще не секрет, что Советский Союз не был светским государством, это была теократия. Больше того, вообще про атеизм, в общем, можно ведь сказать, что это вера. Вера в то, что Бога нет. И, как известно, что более последовательными в этом смысле являются люди, которые называют себя агностиками. А атеист — это не неверующий человек, это верующий человек. И Советский Союз был устроен как теократия по всем. Это, в общем-то, можно сказать, церковь, можно сказать, религиозный орден. И с этой точки зрения, если посмотреть, то религия никогда никуда не уходила, нигде. И войны религиозные, они, в общем-то, были. Просто религии менялись. менялись местами. Вот. На первый план выходили одни, потом на первый план выходили другие религии. Но секуляризация – это такой, в общем-то, получается, ну, самообман. Секуляризация, в общем, не существует. Сегодня вот в первой половине дня выступление было про теологические основания вот, либерализма, да, вот, где вот, докладчик вскрывал фактически религиозные корни светских политических учений. Вот, показывая, что на самом деле они тоже религиозные. Вот, поэтому, если с этой точки зрения посмотреть, имеет ли смысл постановка вопроса вот в такой плоскости, что это возврат религии? Может, это не возврат религии, а просто вот выход на первый план тех религий, которые были, вот с этой точки зрения, если посмотреть.
Ну, спасибо за вопрос. Так, меня слышно, да? Ну, во-первых, я не думаю, что это совсем те же самые религии, вот, так как мы только что этот вопрос как раз и подняли. Я думаю, что возвращается, так говоря, что-то другое. Это не та же самая церковь, это не те же самые движения. Но что интересно, это что они себя позиционируют как антисекулярные, и они ведут какой-то диалог с светским государством, с либеральными ценностями. И вообще, мне кажется, что вот все вот... Я с вами абсолютно согласна, и, кстати, моя книга так заканчивается, что вот если бы советская власть реально была секулярной, то они бы посмотрели на общество там 60-х, 70-х, которые, ну, они изучали его, где все индифферентны к религиозным вопросам, и они бы сказали, все, мы как бы уже выиграли, можем отойти от этого вопроса. Но для них это было не победа, а наоборот, они хотели выработать так называемую атеистическую убежденность. И это именно говорит, что это не секуляризация, а обращение к другой вере. Но это как бы политический, идеологический вопрос. Поэтому я думаю, что все это для меня подчеркивает, вот, например, законодательство 90-го года, они были как, ну, я понимаю, я не так близко их изучала, но это были либерально, как бы основаны на либеральной, религиозное законодательство российское 90-го года, которое до 97-го было. Оно было основано на неких либеральных принципах. Свобода совести, там, толерантность. И это изменилось в 1997 году. И просто чем больше я об этом думаю, тем более я думаю, что секуляризм, секулярность – это либеральный проект политический, и без него он не может просто, ну, как бы секулярность не может существовать. Поэтому, когда идет война против либерализма, она связывает с собой вот эти секулярные ценности. И я просто не вижу, например, у меня есть коллега, которая называет советский атеизм atheist secular, атеистический секуляризм. Для меня это как бы этот термин непонятен. Потому что секулярность не может, как бы сам принцип это не неверие, а отношение к авторитету. Я не знаю, если я правильно выразила это.
Спасибо. Еще, может быть, для одного вопроса, да, есть время.
Thank you very much for this talk. I was actually struck by one of the last remarks that you made on the people in the Communist Party in the late 80s saying, well, let's have those who believe in both Communist Party and the church rather than those who don't believe in anything. I'm thinking now of this recent, attempt of synthesis of which is widely known as communist orthodoxy or orthodox communism, which current Communist Party is trying to accomplish. Well, this is arguably weak. They're trying to chip away at the ruling party by doing that, but this is arguably weak. So now I see this as a continuation of the late Soviet project. So I'm wondering whether those people in late Soviet nomenclatura, they were trying to build some kind of intellectual synthesis. Well, because of course everybody's aware of the eschatological motives behind communism. So communism is not that hostile to Christianity. The question is whether they were thinking along these lines, or they were just simply trying to put everything into the pot in order to stay aboard.
I wouldn't.
Is there anything that Communist Party of today
Yes.
would learn from them?
I wouldn't say it was an intellectual project. I think it was a political calculation. I think by the late 1980s it had become so clear that secularism in its communist form, or atheism in this case, was so bankrupt, as was the ideology, that you really couldn't build a political platform on it. It just had no legitimacy and no social resonance. And so I think, at least to my mind, there's a political calculus that's happening. And you can ask all sorts of questions. How many people really ever abandoned, their faith to or their kind of love for the faith of their ancestors and their babushki who baptized them. I mean, these are things that you're not imposing an alien thing. You're kind of re-embracing something that's ostensibly part of your repertoire in some form already. So, and what's interesting in the Soviet case is that it's not the religious dissidents that bring religion back into public life. They're writing letters to the UN, they're writing letters to their co-religionists abroad, but they're not really achieving all that much. It's really, Gorbachev meeting with the patriarch, this comes in through the front door. They say, we actually realize that, this is a part of our history, this is a part of our narrative, right? So that allows for that narrative to emerge in which the two things are not actually contradictory. But I don't see it as a kind of intellectual synthesis. I mean, I think it's a political program that understands that there's no power in the other ideology, and if you hope to retain any kind of resonance and legitimacy, you have to ground it in something else.
Спасибо большое, Виктория. Да, я хочу передать слово не только следующему докладчику, но и следующему модератору. Сергей Елагин продолжит эту секцию. Спасибо.